She was 19 and had just been kicked out. Not eased along with a little money and a kind word, kicked, plain and cold, into a street where nobody would meet her eye. And with $1 silver, the last coin she owned, she bought a boarded-up saddlery on the dying main street of a bypassed cow town in the Texas Panhandle, a leather shop the town had left to the dust when the trail herds stopped coming. The big front window was cracked and gray with grime. The workbenches inside stood buried under 20 years of dust. The freight agent in the next town told her the trade was gone. The town was finished. And a girl alone in a dead man's shop wouldn't see the spring. But what nobody knew, not the agent, not the town, not the girl herself, was that under the cutting bench at the back of that old saddlery, hidden since 1873, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Delphine Marsh had been taught to work leather before she was taught to read, and it was the one thing the world never quite managed to take from her hands. She was born in 1873 in a Texas cow town, the daughter of a harness and saddle maker, and she had grown up in the good clean smell of tanned hide and Neat's foot oil at her father's elbow, learning the trade the way other children learned their letters. Her father was a saddler of the old school, a man who believed a saddle was a moral object, that a badly made tree could break a horse's back and a man's neck, that every stitch was a promise to a stranger you would never meet, that the mark you burned into your finished work was your word made visible. He taught her the whole of it, the cutting and the skiving, the stitching and the stamping, the long patient art of building a thing that a cowboy would trust with his life across 10,000 miles of hard country. By the time Delphine was 14, she could build a saddle tree true and stitch a seam that would outlast the man who bought it. Her hands knew leather the way a musician's know a keyboard, and it was the deepest thing about her. But her father died when she was 16, a winter fever, and here the story turned the way these stories so often turn. Her mother, a practical, frightened woman, remarried inside the year, a smooth-talking horse trader named Royal Pate who had an eye for the saddlery's steady trade and a firm opinion that leather work was a man's craft and no business for a girl. He took over the shop. He could not build a saddle to save his life, but he could hire a journeyman and take the profit. And he could see plainly that his stepdaughter, who could outwork any journeyman in the Panhandle, was a standing rebuke to him. A girl who knew more of the trade than the man who now owned it. So he set about making her small. He kept her to the backroom drudgery, the oiling and the errands, and gave her fine work to the hired man. He told her mother the girl was sullen and idle. And when her mother died too, 3 years on, of a summer sickness, there was nothing left between Delphine and the stepfather who had never wanted her under his roof at all. He moved fast. Within a month of the funeral, Royal Pate told Delphine that a grown girl of 19 had no place in a widower stepfather's house and no claim on a shop that was legally his, and that she had best find her own way before folks began to talk. When she stood in the shop her father had built and said that the trade was hers by right, that she could build a saddle Royal Pate couldn't dream of, that everyone in town knew whose skill kept the place alive, he threw her out the front door with his own hands, and told the gathering street that the poor girl had gone difficult with grief and had to be let go for everyone's peace. The neighbors watched. Not one spoke up. Delphine carried that longest, not the throwing out, but the silence of a town she had cut and stitched and mended for, standing mute on the boardwalk while a smooth man in her father's doorway rewrote her out of her own life. She had $1 silver sewn into the hem of her dress, and her father's roll of leather-working tools, the round knife, the pricking irons, the stitching awls, the maker's stamp with his mark, which she took because they were the one thing in that shop that was truly hers, and the 2 hands that were her whole fortune. She drifted, mending harness and boots and saddle rigging for outfits that would let a woman touch the work, which was rarely, and paid badly when they did, because a girl who worked leather was a thing the frontier did not have a shape for. She grew tired in her hands, the maker's worst tiredness, the kind that comes from being good at a thing the world will not let you do. And she nursed one stubborn wish, not revenge, for revenge was not in her, but a bench of her own, a shop no stepfather could throw her out of, because the door would be hers, and the trade would be hers, and the mark on the finished work would be her own. She heard about the saddlery the way leather workers hear things, in a livery yard from a drover cursing his broken cinch. There was a dead cow town off the old trail, he said, Ledbetter, that had boomed on the trail herds and died when the drives ended and the railroad chose another town, and its old saddle shop had stood boarded up for 20 years, ever since the saddler who kept it passed. The county would take $1 for it just to clear the tax book. Who'd want a saddlery in a town the cattle forgot? The drover laughed. But Delphine Marsh did not laugh. She had $1. And a saddlery, even a dead one, on a dead street, in a town the herds had left, was the one building in all the world shaped exactly like the life that had been stolen from her, fitted already with everything her hands knew how to use. She rode a freight wagon out to Ledbetter and walked the last dusty stretch into a town 3/4 dead, a single wide street of false-fronted buildings bleaching in the panhandle sun, half of them boarded. The great empty cattle pens at the edge of town rotting where 10,000 longhorns had once bawled and milled. There were maybe 150 souls left, the ones the dying trail had stranded, and they watched the stranger come up the street with the flat patience of people who had seen the good times leave and expected nothing to bring them back. And at the center of the street, between a shuttered saloon and a barber shop somehow still open, stood the saddlery, a narrow, deep building with a wide cracked front window, saddlery still legible in faded paint above the door with a name worn nearly away beneath it, its door boarded, its interior a gray dimness behind the dirty glass. Delphine stood in the dusty street and looked at it, and where the drover had seen a dead shop in a dead town, she saw a bench, a whole leather trade sealed up behind boards, waiting 20 years for hands that knew what to do with it. The county's business was done in the live town down the line, at a land office run by a dry, unhurried man named Cassius Fell, who could not fathom the girl's request. The Ledbetter saddlery was worthless, he told her. The trail trade was 20 years dead, and the herds would never come again. The town was emptying by the season. The shop had been boarded since old Amos Kell, the saddler, died back in the 70s, with no heir the county ever found. There was nothing in it, Fell said, but rotted leather and dust and whatever the rats had spared. $1 would put it in her name, and his honest counsel was to keep the $1 and take the next stage to a town with a future in it. Delphine laid her silver $1 on his desk, the last coin she had in the world, and signed her name in a firm, clear hand, and Cassius Fell gave her the deed and a look of plain puzzlement and the settled expectation that the Panhandle would send her back inside a month. The Panhandle did not send her back. Word went ahead of her into Ledbetter, the way it does in a small place, that a girl had bought the old saddle shop, and the town's opinion split the way towns do. Some thought her simple, some thought her strange, and most gave her the wide, wary berth they gave anything new. But there was one who did not, and she was the one who mattered. An old black man named Moses Hakes, who had come up the trail as a drover in the great years and stayed on when the herd stopped, and who shod horses and mended gear at the edge of town for the few who still needed it, came to look at the girl who'd bought the saddlery and stood in the door watching her pry the boards loose. He had known the shop in its day, he told her, had brought his own rigging there for 20 years, had known the saddler who kept it, a quiet, particular man, the best hand with leather he ever saw. And when he watched Delphine set to work, when he saw how she handled her father's round knife, the easy, certain way of a person born to it, the old man's face changed. And he said that, whatever the fool at the land office thought, if she could work leather with hands like those, then she had come to exactly the right building. He stayed the afternoon. He came back the next day, and the next, an old drover drawn to the smell of leather and the sight of the trade coming back to life, and Delphine, who had been thrown out into a town's silence, found she had. At last, one person glad she had come. She poured herself into the shop the way you pour yourself into the one thing that fits your hands. She pried off the boards and let the light back into the deep, narrow room, and where the town saw ruin, she saw the bones of everything she loved. The long cutting bench, scarred and sound, where a saddler laid out and cut his hides, the stitching horse. The clamp that held the work while you sewed, the racks of tools and the great flat skiving stones, the pattern boards on the walls, the ghost shapes of a maker's whole life. It was all there, dust-shrouded and waiting, a complete leather trade's worth of shop that she could never in her life have afforded to fit out. Delphine ran her hand along the cutting bench her stepfather's shop had never let her call her own, and behind it, for the first time since Royal Pate's hands had shoved her into the street, she felt her feet under her. This was her place. Not on sufferance. Not until a man with a deed decided otherwise. Hers, that first night she made a bed of clean swept hides in the back of the shop, in the good old smell of leather and oil that was the smell of her whole childhood, and she lay in the dark listening to the building settle around her. It should have frightened a girl of 19, alone in a dead man's shop in a town 3/4 gone. It did not. She had been frightened for 3 years in other people's houses, frightened every day in her stepfather's shop that a wrong word would put her on the road, frightened in every borrowed corner she'd slept in since. Here, in a building that was hers by deed and dollar, with her father's tools rolled out on a bench that no one could order her away from, she found she was not frightened at all. The smell of the leather was like her father's hand on her shoulder. The dark was her own dark. She thought of the town's silent boardwalk, of all the mute watching faces the day Royal Pate threw her out, and she found the memory had lost some of its power to wound. Because those people were far away now, and this shop was near, and a person with a bench of her own does not have to care so much what a town that failed her thinks. She slept better on those hides than she had in 3 years of other people's beds, and she woke to the panhandle sun coming gold through the grimy front window, and she did not rise until she had decided, all the way down, that nothing would move her from this place. She had $1 gone and almost nothing to work with, but she had the one thing the dying town still needed and no longer had, hands that could make and mend the leather a cattle country runs on. Moses Hakes was the beginning of it. He brought her, that first week, a saddle with a broken tree, his own, that he'd ridden the trail on for 30 years and could not bear to give up and could not find a soul to mend. Delphine took it apart on the cutting bench, the way her father had taught her, and found the cracked tree and the failing rigging, and rebuilt it true and stitched it back with a seam that would outlast them both. She set it on the stitching horse when it was done, and old Moses ran his hand over the mended saddle that had carried him up the trail in his youth, and could not speak for a while. After that, Delphine Marsh did not want for work. The word went out and down the country the way word does. There was a hand at Ledbetter who could build a saddle like the old days and mend anything with a stitch in it. They came from all over the panhandle, the broken saddles, the split harness, the worn-out boots and cracked rigging and the good gear gone to ruin that a hard country could not replace and had been quietly making do without. She charged fair and built true and mended what others called hopeless, and within 2 months the dead Saddlery was the busiest building in Ledbetter, and the town that had watched her come with flat patience had begun, cautiously, to be glad of her. She restored the shop as she built a saddle, patiently, every part made true, and she came, in time, to the great cutting bench at the back, because it was the heart of the shop, and it wobbled, its heavy top settled askew on its base after 20 years, and a cutting bench that would not sit true was no use to a saddler. She meant only to level it and set it right. But when she cleared it off and crawled beneath it to shim the base, she found what 20 years and a careful man had hidden. The floor beneath the cutting bench was not the plank of the rest of the shop. One broad section, in the deep shadow the bench had cast for 20 years, was a fitted trapdoor, cut to the grain of the surrounding boards, dusted and dark, invisible to anyone who had not crawled beneath the bench with a purpose. She knew it the way her father had taught her to know a flaw in a hide, by a wrongness her hands found before her eyes could name it. The board gave, faintly, when she pressed it. It had been meant to lift. She got her fingers into the seam and raised it, and beneath it, in a dry-lined cavity in the panhandle earth, sat not a strongbox, not gold, but something that stopped her breath in a different way. A stack of finished leatherwork, wrapped in oiled cloth against the years, saddles, small ones, and belts, and a child's pair of boots, and a lady's fine-worked bag, a dozen beautiful finished pieces, each one wrapped and laid away with care. And on top of them, a heavy ledger and a folded letter, the paper gone amber, the hand plain and strong, addressed on the outside, to the saddler who comes after me. Her hands, steady from a lifetime of fine work, were not quite steady now. She sat on the floor beneath her own cutting bench and unfolded it, and read. "If you have found this," it began, "then you have leveled the cutting bench, and if you have leveled the cutting bench, then you mean to work leather here. You are a saddler, as I was, and so I can tell you a thing I could never tell the living, one maker to another, for only a maker will understand it. Sit. This is not a confession of a crime. It is a confession of a debt, and a stranger sort of treasure than you might have hoped for, and I ask you to hear me out before you judge whether it was worth the finding." His name had been Amos Kell, and he had kept the Ledbetter Saddlery for 30 years, through the whole roaring life of the trail town, and he had a thing to explain about the pieces beneath the bench. They were, he wrote, his unpaid debts, but not debts owed to him. Debts he owed. For 30 years, in a hard cattle country, Amos Kell had made saddles and gear for men who could not always pay. Drovers and cowboys who ordered a saddle on the promise of a season's wages and then died on the trail, or were paid off and drifted, or fell on times too hard to settle up. And a lesser saddler would have counted those losses and moved on. But Amos Kell was a man of the old moral school, and he could not bear an unfinished promise. When a man ordered a saddle and paid something down and then vanished, died or drifted, or was ruined, Amos Kell finished the saddle anyway. He built the piece the man had paid his deposit on, built it true and whole as if the man were coming back for it, and when the man never came, he wrapped it and laid it away beneath the cutting bench, unwilling to sell another man's saddle, unwilling to leave a promise unkept. "I could not sell them," he wrote. Each one was made for a particular man, to a particular measure, paid for in part with a particular hope, and to sell that hope to a stranger felt to me like a theft of something that cannot be weighed. So I finished them, and I kept them, all these years, a whole cellar of kept promises to men who never came back. It is the strangest inventory a saddler ever hid, I know. But there is more to it, and here is the part that matters. For Amos Kell, it turned out, had done something with those debts that made them in the end worth more than gold. He had kept the ledger, the record of every man who had ever ordered a piece and not returned for it, with the little he knew of each, the name, the outfit, the home place if the man had ever named one, the deposit paid, the piece built and laid away. 30 years of vanished drovers catalogued with a saddler's patient care. And late in his life, growing old and knowing his heart was failing, Amos Kell had understood what he truly held. Not saddles, but a way home for the lost. For many of those men, he wrote, had families somewhere, mothers, wives, children, who had never learned what became of a son or husband who rode north with a herd and simply never came back, swallowed by the vast anonymous country the way so many were. And Amos Kell, from his little shop, had begun, in his last years, the slow work of tracing them, writing letters, asking after names, trying to carry to some grieving family the small terrible mercy of knowing, here is the saddle he ordered, here is the deposit he paid, here is proof he passed this way and meant to come back. Here at last is a place to set your grief. I ran out of time, he wrote. There are more names in this ledger than I could trace in the years left to me, and I could not bear to leave the work half done, nor to let these kept promises be sold for scrap when I died. So I leave them to you, Whoever you are, not gold, I know, and I am sorry if you hoped for gold. But there is a small fortune here too, of a kind I have set aside. In the tin at the bottom, the savings of an old saddler who lived plain, enough to keep you at your bench while you do what I ask. And what I ask is this. Finish my work. Take the ledger and trace the families I could not reach, and carry them the truth about the men who never came home. Give each kept promise back to the people it belongs to. Do this, and you will have done what I ran out of years to do, and you will understand, as I came to, that the finest thing a saddler ever makes is not a saddle. It is a promise kept. A. Kell, saddler, in the last autumn of my life, 1873. Delphine Marsh sat beneath her own cutting bench with the letter in her lap and the panhandle light slanting through the wide front window, and she wept, not for gold, for there was little, but for the size of the thing an old man had left in her hands. She lifted the wrapped pieces one by one and understood them now. Not merchandise, but promises. Each saddle and belt and child's boot a vow an honest man had kept to someone who never came back. And at the bottom, as he had said, a modest tin of coin. An old saddler's plain savings. Enough to keep her at her bench, but no fortune by any measure. The treasure was not the coin. The treasure was the ledger, and the terrible tender work it named, a whole book of lost men and the families who had never stopped wondering, and a dead saddler's charge to carry them home. She showed old Moses Hakes because he was the only soul she had, and because he had come up the trail himself and knew what it was to be a man the country could have swallowed without a trace. And when she read him the letter, the old drover bowed his head, and was quiet a long time, and then he told her that he had ridden with men whose names were surely in that book. Men he'd trailed beside for a season and never seen again. Men whose people back home he had sometimes wondered about on the long nights and never known how to reach. He turned the ledger's pages with a horseman's careful hands, and here and there he stopped and touched a name and said, "Lo, I knew him." And Delphine understood that the ledger was not a list of debts at all, the way Amos Kell had said, but a list of people someone had refused to let vanish, and that she had been handed the keeping of it. And then Delphine Marsh did the thing the old saddler had charged her to do, and it became the work of her life, alongside her bench. She did not report the tin of coin to Cassius Fell or the county, for it was little and it was left for a purpose, and she used it exactly as Amos Kell had meant, to keep her at her work while she did the other work, the tracing. With old Moses's memory of the trail outfits, and the ledger's patient records, and a great many letters written in her firm, clear hand to sheriffs and churches and postmasters across a dozen states, Delphine Marsh began, one name at a time, to carry the lost home. It was slow, and much of it failed, for the country had swallowed many past all finding. But some it did not. A mother in Tennessee learned at last what had become of a son who rode north 30 years before and was never heard from again, and received, wrapped in oiled cloth, the saddle he had ordered and half paid for and meant to come home to, proof, after 3 decades of not knowing, that he had lived and worked and meant to return. A grown woman in Missouri, a child when her father vanished up the trail, received the little pair of boots he had ordered built for her before he died. Boots she was 40 years too old to wear and wept over as if they were the man himself. One by one, the kept promises went home, and with each one a family that had lived for decades with the open wound of not knowing was given, at last, a place to set their grief. Delphine learned, in the doing of it, what Amos Kell had learned before her, that the not knowing was the cruelest thing of all. A death could be mourned and slowly healed. But a vanishing left a wound that never closed, a mother who set a place at the table for 40 years, a child who grew up scanning the faces of strangers for a father's, a wife who could neither remarry nor grieve because she did not know whether she was a widow. The men in Amos Kell's book had ridden north into the enormous anonymous country and simply dissolved, as thousands did in those years, and their people had been left holding a silence that ate at them for the rest of their lives. And what Delphine carried them was not comfort, exactly. A saddle could not bring a man back, but an end to the silence, a fixed and certain fact to grieve at last. He came this far. He meant to come home. Here is the proof of it. You may stop watching the road now. She came to understand that this was itself a kind of saddlery, in the deepest sense her father had meant. That a promise kept across 30 years and 1,000 miles was the truest thing a maker could ever build, more lasting than any leather, and that an old man had understood this and spent his last years and his whole hidden fortune of kept promises on it, and had trusted a stranger to finish the work. She did not intend to fail that trust. She wrote her letters late into the nights, by lamplight after the day's leather was done, and she kept at it for years, and the map of pins on the shop wall grew slowly fuller, one lost man brought home at a time. The story of it spread, the way such stories do, and it did a thing Delphine had never sought. It made the Ledbetter Saddlery known across the whole cattle country not just as the shop of a fine saddler, but as the place that brought the lost trailmen home. Drovers began to stop there on purpose to ask whether a brother, a father, a partner lost up the trail might be in the old saddler's book. Some found their answer. And the shop that a smooth stepfather's greed and a town's silence had thrown a girl out to find became, improbably, one of the most beloved buildings in the Panhandle, a place where a hard country came to close its oldest wounds. Cassius Fell, the land agent who had told her the Panhandle would send her back inside a month, lived to see the dead saddlery become the busiest and best-loved shop for 100 miles, and came out on business within 2 years, and had the grace to tell the young saddler that he had never been so glad to be so wrong about a town or a girl. And Royal Pate, the stepfather, down in the home country, the one who had thrown her out and rewritten her out of her own life, she heard of him over the years, the way you hear of such people. Her father's old shop had not prospered under him. A saddlery is only as good as the hands in it, and Pate's hired men came and went, and the fine trade drifted elsewhere, up the country, in fact, to a certain shop at Ledbetter, though he never knew it. And when at last the whisper reached him that the stepdaughter he'd cast out had made herself the most respected saddler in the Panhandle, he wrote to her, wheedling. Blood being blood and times being hard, surely she'd not see her own mother's husband want. She read the letter at her cutting bench, with her father's maker's stamp at her elbow and Amos Kell's ledger of kept promises on the shelf above. And then she did the only thing that fit. She sent him no money. She sent him instead a single object, wrapped in oiled cloth, a saddle, built by her own hands, true and whole and stamped with her own maker's mark, her father's mark, that she had made her own. And with it one line, in her firm clear hand, my father taught me that every saddle is a promise. You never learn to keep one. Here is what his teaching made of me. She sent nothing else, and Royal Pate did not write again, and she did not think of him often, because a saddler with a book of promises to keep has little time for a man who never kept a one. If you go out into the Texas Panhandle today, to the near-vanished town of Ledbetter, and few do, it is mostly gone to grass and wind, though a little of it lived where its neighbors died, and the old folks say it was the saddle shop that saved it. The saddlery still stands on the wide street, kept as a museum now by the County Historical Society, and the great cutting bench is still there. And beneath it the trapdoor is left open behind glass, showing the lined cavity where an old saddler kept 30 years of promises. On the walls hang the ledger, open to its patient columns of the lost, and beside it a map stuck with pins where each kept promise finally went home, and framed above the bench 2 makers' stamps side by side, an old saddler's, and the one a thrown-out girl made her own. Children are brought there and told the story of the saddler who could not leave a promise unkept, and the girl the world threw away who spent her life keeping them for him. And burned into the front of the cutting bench, in a saddler's careful letters, is the thing Delphine Marsh came to believe over her long life at that bench, which is also the whole creed of the trade she handed down. The finest thing a maker makes is a promise kept. There is a kind of inheritance that has nothing to do with blood or gold, but with promises, the ones an honest maker keeps to strangers he will never meet, handed down from one pair of trustworthy hands to the next. It waits in the dark beneath the workbenches of the world, not for the one who wants a fortune, but for the one who will understand that a kept promise is worth more than any fortune. The world had told Delphine Marsh she was worthless the same way it had told that shop it was dead, with a shut door and a low price, and a town's cold silence. It only ever takes one person who knows how to keep a promise to prove the world's cold arithmetic wrong. Delphine Marsh was 19 years old and kicked out. She had $1 silver to her name, and she spent it on a boarded-up saddlery on the dead street of a dying cow town in the Texas Panhandle. It was the best dollar she ever spent. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, is there someone whose fate your family never learned, whom you still wonder about? We'd love to hear your story. See you in the next one.